Hi, future millionaires and billionaires. Welcome back to Unlock the Property Market Secrets with Siphokazi. My name is Siphokazi Ngonde. Join me as I dive deep into the insights, tips, and tricks to help you navigate the real estate world. Welcome to the new year. This is our first video of the year. So please join me as I do know that new year usually comes with a lot of pressure, whether from social media or from your internal self. But before you make that property decision, before you make any commitment, before you move out, before you sign anything, join me as I help you to financially prepare for your property decision in 2026. So before you can commit to anything, it is very important that you understand your property goal for the new year, which is whether you want to move into a new house in terms of renting, or you want to buy a new property, or you want to renovate an existing building that you have. It is very important that you have a clear understanding of what your goals are. And then also you need to understand the short-term versus the long-term plans of the property goal. In terms of if you are renting a new property space, how long are you planning to rent that property space, and what are your goals afterwards? Let me make an example. If you are moving into a new house, maybe your goal would be, I want to stay in this house for maybe 5 years and then I can start building my own house. I'll be done in that 5 years. So maybe your goal is you are moving into a new place, you're gonna stay there for 5 years, and then after 5 years you'll be moving into a new house that you have built yourself. So it's very important that you lay out those plans before you can make any decision. And then in terms of maybe renovating a property, it is very important that you understand whether you want to then resell the property or you want to use the property after you renovated it. It's very important that you understand those plans at the beginning. And then you have to look at affordability versus lifestyle. You look at the lifestyle that you're living now versus the plans that you have. Is there a need for you to adjust your lifestyle in order for you to afford the house that you want to move into? So those are the things that you also need to understand. And it is very important that you do avoid the social media pressure. I know it's a new year, everyone is unboxing things and everyone is coming up with those vision boards and everything. Everyone has a house and they are on their vision board. So it's very important that you avoid that kind of pressure and do know that clarity comes before you start budgeting. And once you've understood your property goals, it is then important that you understand the property costs that are associated with whatever goal you have for your property. So for renters, it is very important that you know that deposits and rents for that month is not the only money that you will need to have in the first month of moving in. So let me just paint a picture for renters. So you would need your rents for that month. Right now, as I'm shooting, it's February. So let's say you're gonna need rent money for February. You're gonna need a deposit depending on where you're moving into. Other people would require it to be like one equivalent to 1 month rent. Others would say 2 months. So it's important that you have that deposit and then you have rent for that month. And that is not the only money you're gonna need, but you're also gonna need money for utilities, and that speaks to your electricity, that speaks to your water. Before you can move into a house, you need to make sure that there is water that is connected to the house, and you need to pay for that as well as electricity. You're not gonna light up a candle after you move into your new house. So it's very important that you do factor in those costs. And also you're gonna need maybe money for your internet fiber. Depending on what network you are using, you're gonna be needing internet for that month. So it's important that you also factor in those costs as well as your transport costs, especially because I believe that most of the people who are watching this podcast are people who are working, or they are students, or whatever the case may be. So it means that you would have to be commuting to another space. So it is important that you factor in your transport costs. If let's say it's gonna be 20 bucks to go to your workspace or school or wherever, it's important that you budget for 40 emalangeni or 40 rents depending on where you are for transport. So then you can draw up how much you're gonna need for that month. So on top of the utilities, on top of internet deposits and rent, you also need to factor in your transport costs. And lastly, you should also factor in for rental increases, annual rental increases. So you may or you may not know that usually landlords at the end of each financial year, whatever their financial year would be, they usually increase their rental prices. So it's important to keep that in mind. Just because the rent this year was 5,000, it doesn't mean it's gonna be 5,000 next year. It can probably go up to 5.2. So you need to factor in for those. Or probably you move in on the last month of their financial year, and next thing the following month their rent has gone up. So you have to also factor that in mind. And usually their rental increases, they usually run between 5% to 10% depending on the landlord. So you also have to keep that in mind. And then for property owners or people who are looking to buy properties, there are also costs that are associated with it. I may have probably left out some, but I've just listed the most important ones. So firstly, you're gonna have your bond repayments. Chances are you are not gonna buy that house cash. You're gonna require a loan from the bank. So every month you're gonna be paying a certain amount of money towards that loan to the bank. So you need to have that money in mind, how much you're gonna be repaying every month. And that comes from how good you are at negotiating at the early stages. Maybe in another video we can get into how you can negotiate to be in a better position for like better loan repayment terms. Now moving on to the property costs that are associated with your owners or the people that are looking into buying a new house. There is bond repayment. Chances are you are not gonna buy that house cash. You're gonna require a loan from a bank. So the bank is gonna require you to pay a certain amount each month towards that loan. So it's important that you have that figure in mind, and depending on how good you are at negotiating, it's gonna vary on how much you're gonna repay each month. And then there's also rates and taxes that are associated with properties. Especially in Swaziland, we relate mostly to rates. So each year the municipality requires you to pay a certain amount, which is taken from your property value towards the municipality. So you have to know the exact figure that you're supposed to be paying, and you are supposed to know that beforehand. Before you can buy that property, you must know these figures. You must have them in your head so that it can help you when it comes to budgeting. But also when you are in a sectional title deed situation, which is when you guys are having one building and then there are different owners, you are going to be paying levies which are going towards the maintenance of that property. So you have to keep that in mind. You have to know how much are you going to be paying towards the levies. This is something that you should know before you buy that property. And then you also have to have insurance costs in your budget. I know usually people they tend to ignore the insurance part of the building, but it's very important that you insure your properties in case there is fire or there is whatever that may destroy the property. You need to make sure that they are always insured in case anything goes bad or goes south. You always have a backup plan. So it's important that you insure your building. And again, depending on the value of the property, the insurance costs will vary. And then you can also have the maintenance and repairs cost in mind. Another mistake that most people do is that they usually tend to ignore the maintenance side of the properties. So, but it's very important to know that a property, in order for it to grow in value or in order for it to make you more money, you should maintain it. So you must have those maintenance costs in mind in terms of when are you supposed to repaint, when are you supposed to change the aircon, when are you supposed to change the roofing and everything, and the likes. So you must also know those costs. And there is something that is called a transfer cost. So if you are buying a property from one owner to another, there will be transfer cost, which is the cost of moving the property ownership from one owner to another. So you also have to know how much is that gonna cost? So it's very important that you also you seek professional advice very early in your decision making so that you can be aware of all of these costs and you are able to budget for them properly. But a key takeaway from what I've just said now is that if you cannot afford the full property cost, then you cannot afford the property. So if you want to rent but you cannot afford all of the things that are said are associated with renting, all of the costs that are associated with renting, then you cannot afford to move out of your home. So once you've understood your property goals, you know the property cost, it is important that you now build a very realistic property budget. And how do you do that? A very basic rule of thumb when it comes to property cost is that you you should not spend more than 30 to 40% of your gross monthly income towards property rent or repayment. So if you are renting, whatever you are paying towards your rent, it should not cost more than 30 to 40% of what you are earning monthly. So if you are paying about maybe 60% of your income towards rent, then you cannot afford that property. So you must always have that in mind. And then once you've identified that property that's gonna cost between that range that I've just said to you, it's important that you have an emergency fund. You know, anything can happen anytime. You can lose a job or whatever. So you must make sure that you have an emergency fund for at least 3 to 6 months that can help you to maintain that property whilst you are looking for another job or whatever the case may be. And then you must also set up a maintenance reserve, which is where you'll be keeping money that will be allocated towards your maintenance monthly. So you must also divide your maintenance into different categories in terms of which ones should you do monthly, which ones should you do periodically, which ones should you do seasonally. And then you allocate the monies according to those categories. And then you must also keep in mind your seasonal expenses. Um, Now it's summer and it's raining a lot, meaning you have to cut your grass maybe more than once a month, which is, or maybe more than you do during winter. So you must also have to have a reserve for those seasonal expenses where you have to pay a little bit more than the other months. And then lastly, you must plan on interest rate changes. This is for especially people who are buying a property, so you know that you'll be repaying the money that you'll be paying towards your loan. It will depend based on this interest rate. So if your interest rate is up, it means that you'll be paying more, and if it's low, you'll be paying less. So you must keep in mind for those. So just because this month the bond repayments was 3,500, it does not mean you'll be paying 3,500 for the rest of the year. So you must be prepared that on some months you probably get up to 4,000 of the bond repayments. So those are the things that you should do. And you should also ask yourself, what would happen if on what would happen to the budget on the worst of months? And then once you've shown your budget, you should then prepare financially before you commit. And how do you do that? You start by checking your credit record. This is especially for people who want to buy a property. So usually the banks will look at how your credit record is in terms of do you take credit? Do you pay on time? Do you not play, abo play my patilo during the payment season? So they do need to know that. So you should take your credit record in terms of who are you still owing, how much debt do you have, are you paying well and everything. So you must make sure of those things. So now you understand your property goals, you know the property costs that are associated with each decision, and you now know you've set your realistic budget. Now it's time that you actually financially prepare for that decision. How do you do that? You start by checking your credit record. So you know that the banks are always going to look at how much credit you have and how well you are paying it. So it's very important that before you go to that bank, especially for people who want to buy a property, it's important that you look at the existing debts that you have, and you make sure that you clean up everything. clean up what you can, make sure that you are paying every month where you can, and then you must also avoid unnecessary debt. Avoid taking a debt just because you want to buy a new phone, something like that. Just avoid unnecessary debt as you are financially preparing yourself for this decision. And then it is also important that you avoid emotional decisions. Just because your friends are moving out of their houses or they are moving out of home, it does not mean you should also move out of home. Just because your friends are buying new houses does not mean you should buy a new house. So it's important that you avoid emotional decisions, as this will cost you greatly. And also do plan for future increases, as I've also mentioned prior, that there are interest rate changes, there is annual rental increases. You should keep these things in mind. And you should also ask yourself that would you still afford this if something goes wrong? And then I want to also touch base on the common mistakes that you should avoid whilst you are making this decision. Firstly, you must not use all of your savings as a deposit. I know young people, they can't wait to move out of home, they can't wait to have their own space, but do avoid taking all of your savings and put them as deposit or as your rents because of the other transport costs that I've mentioned. After you've avoided using all of your savings as deposits, you must not avoid ongoing maintenance. I know most people avoid maintenance, as I've mentioned before, but do not avoid maintenance because it's gonna cost you more than it gives you benefits. I know it seems like it's an avoidable cost, but trust me, it's gonna cost you greatly in the future. So do not avoid maintenance. Do not underestimate your lifestyle costs. Be very honest, especially on the budgeting stage. Be very honest with your lifestyle and see where you need to change or where you need to improve. And unfortunately, especially if you're buying a house, you cannot maintain the same lifestyle that you had unless you've won a lotto, guys. That's the only way you can do it. And then you must avoid rushing just because it's a new year. Just because it's a new year does not mean you have to rush into buying a property or you have to rush into moving out. You can still take it slowly. And then lastly, you must not compare your journey to others. I think I've touched on this before, that just because your friends are doing it does not mean you also have to do it. So now that we've mentioned everything, I think it's very important that we look at the action steps that you need to take for the new year. Firstly, you need to review your income and expenses. You review how much are you getting each month and how much are your expenses, and that is gonna help you with your budgeting. And then you set your property goal for the year. Do you want to move out? Do you want to rent a property? Do you want to renovate, or do you want to buy a new property? And then you start your property savings fund immediately, like as soon as now. After listening to this video, you go set up that property saving fund, and then you check your expenses for at least 30 days. I think that's gonna give you a full picture of how much money you spend on your expenses on each month, and that's gonna help you with your budgeting as well, and see how you can teach it and make it work for you. And lastly, you must seek professional advice early, in the very early stages. I think I've also touched on this one earlier. It's important because it's going to help you see where you can move into, where you can buy property, and in terms of the cost that you need to prepare for, it's going to help you with that. And then in closing, I think it's very important to know that property is a financial commitment first, and an emotional decision second. So I do know that it can tend to be very emotional, but do know that it is firstly a financial decision. So before you make that emotional decision, do look at whether you can afford that property or not. And I think that is it for our episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Please do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe on the channel and share with others. And just tell me what more you would like to see on this podcast. And thank you very much for tuning in.